you. So welcome to this symposium, which is jointly organized by the International Association of Agricultural Economists and American Applied Economic Association. The session is on climate change and responses of agriculture. Climate change is, agriculture is contributing nearly a quarter of the GHG emissions, and there is a huge impact of climate change on agriculture. So the presentations we have show in both these directions, the impact of climate change on agriculture and agriculture's impact on climate change. We have three talented speakers, Chris Barrett, Ghazali Isahaku, and Will Martin. And then Shenggen is going to be the discussant for all three papers. So I'm going to turn to Chris now. And Chris, you have 18 minutes. Thank you very much for starting this.
Very good. And you can see my slides, I trust.
Yeah, you can see it.
All right, very good. Well, thank you for joining today, and thank you, Uma, for the kind introduction. I'm going to present some new work led by Katie Fiorella, a faculty member here at Cornell, Liz Bajent, Naomi Schwartz, who's at UBC, Shakuntala Thilstead with World Fish. And the work is based off of a World Fish project in Cambodia around community fish refuges. And the question we're asking is, what happens to this gentleman and other people like him as temperatures warm? So what is happening in the ecosystem, and most importantly, what are the behavioral changes induced by warming temperatures that might impact his fish catch? So we want to understand questions like, as temperatures warm, does he change participation in fishing? Does he spend more or less time in fishing? And does he change the gear he's using? Does he use more or less active gear, like you see him actively casting this net? And then what's the net result on his fish catch, which is partly a function of effort and gear choice, but is also partly a function of ecological changes taking place in the background. So ultimately, this gets to the question of what is catch per unit effort change in response to warming temperatures. Why does this matter? Well, first, 10% of people in low and middle income countries rely primarily on fisheries for income or nutrients. We often forget in the agricultural economics community what a large role fisheries play in primary production. And moreover, of all the fishers in the world, 90% of them are small-scale households globally. So this is terribly important to development questions more broadly. Could I perhaps ask people to mute their microphones? The scientific literature on the impacts of global warming on fisheries generally shows that historically, as depicted in this graphic from Free et al.'s paper in Science last year, the overall effect of warming on fish catch has been about a 4% reduction. I'm hearing a lot of typing in the background. Could someone who has their microphone on please mute it? So we know that there's a great deal of evidence now that warming temperatures have declined fish stocks, especially relative to maximum sustainable yield in history, and projections suggest that, if anything, those adverse impacts of warming temperatures on fish catch will be even greater going forward, somewhere between 3 and 13% reduction in fish catch to 2050. But as you can see from various models as depicted in this one graphic, most of this is in marine fisheries. And one of the things that we're concerned about is that a large share of fisher folk are actually fishing freshwater inland fisheries. And freshwater fisheries may respond somewhat differently to climate change. We know relatively little about the likely impacts of climate change on freshwater fisheries, and we know even less about the likely response of fishers in freshwater inland systems to climate change. And why might this be different? Well, inland freshwater bodies are shallower than the oceans are. They're hydrologically distinct, so fish can't migrate hundreds of kilometers. They're limited by the boundaries on the water body. So fish movement and migration are likely to be much more heavily impacted in some ways by warming temperatures because of the geographic and physical limits on movement. Moreover, because they're shallower, smaller bodies of water, the potential impacts on water quality through invasive species, through warming and pollution, through eutrophication are potentially greater. And there are direct competing human demands for fresh water for residential use, irrigation, energy. And in Cambodia, where we're studying in the Son Ly Tap district, the construction of dams is a very big issue. So the takeaway here is we know relatively little about the impacts of climate change on freshwater fisheries, although this is where small households are particularly vulnerable, it seems.
Yeah. Have the email the same? Yeah, this a pre-proposal.
I'm sorry, could people please mute? Thank you. And whoever is controlling the session can perhaps mute everybody. So our contributions in this paper, sorry, Audu, could you please mute yourself? Thank you. Our contributions in this paper are to tackle this question of what's happening in freshwater fisheries, and in particular, we're studying smallholder fishers' behavioral responses to warming temperatures. We can use this to estimate how warming temperatures impact fisher behaviors, but also how it impacts fish catch. And we can try to net out, by controlling for fisher behaviors, we can sort of back out what's the catch per unit effort impact of warming temperatures, which is a byproduct of both behavioral response and ecological responses. To be clear, we can't observe the ecology in that we're not studying what's happening in fish reproduction and fish movement and things like that. So this paper is based off of household panel survey data collected by World Fish, a little bit more than 400 households over 19 different time periods. So this is the strength of the data set, is this is high frequency bi-monthly, every 2-month data collected from November of 2012 through November of 2015 across 40 CFRs, community fish refuges, which were institutions created to try to protect freshwater fish in the Tonle Sap Lake Basin in central Cambodia, and World Fish, working with partners in the region, were working on trying to see whether they could stabilize and improve fishery performance in this area, and with favorable impacts for fisher livelihoods and diets. So in these data, in these survey data over 19 different time points for 300 plus households, it's an unbalanced panel. We were able to look in detail at their effort at fishing, the gear they use, and what their catch has been over the last 7 days. So those are the key data we're going to use from the survey, where I've already said this, the key variable we'll focus on is fish catch. I'm going to talk about fish. We also look at other aquatic animals, things like snakes and turtles and frogs, and other aquatic plants. All of these are harvested and used both for sale and for direct consumption. And in talking about participation, what we're really looking at is whether any member of the household, not necessarily just the survey respondent, whether any member of the household has fished over the past 7 days, and how many person days the entire household spent fishing. We'll also look at the types of gear that are used. This matters because there's a big difference in energy expenditure between whether you are actively engaged in seining, like in the upper left with 2 people in a net, or a single net caster like that photo I showed you previously, or these interesting traps or spears that people use to try to catch any of a variety of fish and animals, or to harvest aquatic vegetation. These all require some active effort, while there are also traps that people can just sit in a body of water. So they'll put them in the irrigation canal, they'll put it in a floodplain that has standing water in it for an extended period of time, and they'll passively catch fish and snakes and things like that. So gear choice matters to catch, but also matters to the amount of effort people put in. We matched the survey data with secondary data on air temperature, emphasize air temperature. There were water temperature data collected by WorldFish, but they're much more limited. They're both more limited in space. They won't vary by household because they're for each of the 40 CFRs. But moreover, water temperature is potentially endogenous to an awful lot of behavioral responses, and it's strongly correlated with air temperature. So we use gridded air temperature data as our exogenous variable. Rainfall data we also merge in, and we look at flood data, the extent of flood coverage within each CFR range. When combined with rainfall data, that's essentially controlling for the hydrology and the depth of the water, because holding rainfall constant, a greater flooded area means that there was less ability to absorb the water in the basin. Now, what we're going to study directly is the behavioral pathway. So we look at temperature up at the top of this graphic. We don't directly study alternate activities. There is some survey data on this, but it's not comprehensive enough to build a proper labor allocation model. But we'll look at temperature and how it impacts these three fishing effort indicators: fishing participation, time spent fishing, and gear choice. And we can look at how temperature impacts on fish catch, directly in reduced form, as well as mediated by fishing effort. What we can't directly observe is the ecological effects on population. We can't look at reproductivity, we can't look at disease rates, we can't look at the change in the availability of food for fish, and all of those ecological effects could be either positive or negative. It's not analytically obvious which way fish populations should move in response to this warming. Higher CO2 concentrations can promote greater growth of algae, and warmer populations may improve the fecundity of some species, harm the fecundity of others. It's hard to know what net population change would be. So we can't directly observe the ecological pathway. We can back out of it a little bit by studying the fish catch and controlling for behaviors. We can make some inferences about catch per unit effort. So the three questions we're going to ask are: first, what's the effect of temperature on fishing effort, on the participation, a 0-1 variable, on days spent fishing and gear choice? Question two, what's the net effect, which means combining both the behavioral responses and whatever ecological responses might exist. What's the net effect of temperature on fish catch? And then once we control for behavioral change induced by temperature rises, what is the ecological effect on catch per unit effort, on total catch? So our estimation strategy for that first question, this is a simple linear probability model for the fishing participation variable, if they fish or don't fish. And here we exploit the panel, 19 observations for those who are in the full run of the panel. So with individual fixed effects, we're identifying, and with month fixed effects, we're identifying off of within household changes in temperature that are greater than the norm for that month. So we're controlling for seasonality, and we're controlling for locational differences, and we're controlling for idiosyncratic time invariant household differences. So we'll study the continuous person days as the second part of that participation choice, and then we'll look at active gear use, where this is just a binary 0-1 variable for whether half or more of the gear they used was active. This is a relatively binary variable as it happens, but there are a few people who use several different types of gear. For the second question, where we're looking at the impact on fish catch, a large share of observations are zeros, just under half, 48% are zeros. So we have to handle the censoring. So we'll use Beau-Honoré's Tobit correlated random effects estimator there to estimate how temperature is impacting fish catch. And then once we include as right-hand side variables the various fishing participation questions, gear use, amount of time spent fishing, we're netting out of that what is effectively catch per unit effort. So that's our estimation strategy. The net results here, I won't show you tables, But the net result here is pretty clear. There is a pretty sharp negative effect of rising temperatures on fishing participation. So these graphics show you the estimated marginal effects on the probability of fishing, allowing for nonlinearities in the potential relationships. Those who are interested, I can send you the paper, you can see all the details. But the way to read this is that, for example, starting from 28 degrees Celsius, which is the mean temperature in this data set, you would expect a 1 degree rise to have about a 6% negative impact on the probability of going fishing in the last 7 days. So this is a fairly large statistically significant effect on the likelihood that people fish. As temperatures warm, they're spending their time on other things. We can't observe exactly what they're spending their time on, but we can observe they're spending less effort fishing. Conditional on fishing, we notice that there is not a significant effect on the number of days one spends fishing. It's a negative estimated relationship, but it's not statistically significantly different from zero. And gear use has no statistically significant relationship with temperature change, although the likelihood of using active gear is positively associated with temperature change. As temperatures fall, it does seem much more likely that people will use passive gear, which is consistent with the idea of cooler temperatures slowing fish movement and increasing the likelihood that you can trap them. But these relationships are relatively weak. They're borderline as temperatures fall. And the real question here is temperatures rising, where there's no statistically significant relationship. So the takeaway on behavioral change is that warmer temperatures reduce the likelihood that these small rural households take time to go fishing. So what's happening to fish catch? When we look at just the pure reduced form effect, we see this negative relationship between temperature rise and fish catch. So the left-hand graphic shows the estimated marginal effect on log of fish catch, and it's nowhere close to statistically significant. So it's negative, consistent with the various studies that ignore fisher behavioral response that I showed you earlier, but it's not statistically significant. When we control for behavioral effects on the right-hand side, we get a very different result. We see a strikingly positive effect on catch per unit effort. So keep in mind that we're controlling now for how much time people spend fishing. So fish catch holding constant how much time people are spending. As temperatures change, that's telling us what's the impact on catch per unit effort. And so as temperatures warm, we're seeing a pronounced increase in catch per unit effort. And that is consistent with the idea that people are reducing the amount of labor time. Their likelihood of going fishing is lower, so they're less likely to go fishing. That means that they should be fishing when they see a higher marginal return to it. That's consistent with other findings from other settings and other data that find increased effort at things like weeding. When you see higher temperatures, so people's time is being diverted to other pursuits away from fishing. If they are fishing less frequently, then the marginal return to fishing is increasing. So it's a pretty consistent, straightforward story. So just to recap, the takeaways we have are that a 1 to 2 degree Celsius rise above the current mean temperature of 28 means that fishers are somewhere 6 to 14% less likely to fish, with no statistically significant effect on the number of days they spend fishing, conditional on fishing, or on gear use. There's no net impact on fish catch, but because they're fishing less, there's a significant increase in estimated fish catch per unit effort. So we're seeing an effect of warming on the behavior of fishers in these inland freshwater locations. Cambodia has the highest per capita consumption of freshwater fish and aquatic species of any country on Earth. So this is the sort of thing that can really matter. So with that, why don't I stop and thank you for your comments and turn it back to Uma. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chris. I'll reserve all the questions to the question period, and I'll turn to our next speaker, who is Isahaku Ghazali from Ghana, I'm sorry. And they have done a lot of interesting work on climate change and impacts and adoption of new technologies in Ghana. So I'll turn to him. Isahaku, are you there?
Yes, Uma, I'm there.
Good. Nice to hear you.
Nice to hear you too. Yes. Good afternoon. Good morning to you in the US.
Thank you.
I'm doing this work together with Professor Udu Abdullahi from University of Kiel. And this is as a result of the need to adopt climate smart agriculture to enable farmers adjust to changing climate and to adjust to the effects of rising temperature and then flooding conditions and other effects of changing climate. We try to focus on the adoption of climate smart agriculture practices and how the adoption affects farm performance and risk exposure. By way of outline, we would like to show you
Can you please turn off your mute? Can everybody please mute their...
Can I go now?
Yes, please.
Yeah, so we'll look at the motivation for the study, the framework within which we have done the this study. I will look at the data, then we'll talk about the results and probably look at conclusions and recommendations. Basically, climate still remains a threat to many sectors, particularly the agriculture sector, the livelihoods and the developmental aspirations of many communities, individuals, and countries. And this threat is likely to undermine the success of the the Sustainable Development Goals, especially that have to do with the ending hunger and also achieving sustainable development within the context of climate change. What is driving this change is basically due to the increasing global temperatures, and that is likely to hit a change of up to 5 degrees by the end of the 21st century. This projection, a recent study has shown that climate due to COVID, there has been a reduction in emission levels by up to almost 17% as of April. But this particular projection here is pre-COVID projection. And in Ghana, over the past 6 decades, up to 2 degrees rise in temperature has been observed, especially within the savanna agro-ecological zones in Ghana. And this is what is driving these emission levels, includes the agriculture sector. And according to the Environmental Protection Agency in Ghana, the agriculture sector alone is among the greatest source of emissions, contributing up to 54%. And another study globally indicates that greenhouse gas emissions from the agriculture sector is close to 29%. And these rising emission levels, coupled by increase in temperature, could lead to varied distribution rainfall patterns. Some areas will experience extreme shortage of rainfall, other areas excess of rainfall, and that will lead to the droughts and then flooding situations across the world, and which will have implications on agriculture yields across the globe. Some areas might benefit somehow, but greater portions or greater locations in the world will experience extreme yield losses, and up to 50% is projected in some areas in the globe. And this calls for the need to adapt climate smart agriculture. Climate smart agriculture is expected to achieve some basic objectives, and that includes enabling farmers to adapt to climate change, enabling farmers or nations, communities, or whatever to minimize greenhouse gas emissions. And then it climate smart agriculture will also enable us to contribute to food security and other developmental goals. And that is likely to play crucial roles in the achievement of the sustainable development goals. Though the concept might appear new somehow, it has some linkages with previous or prior approaches, and that includes sustainable development, sustainable intensification, and what others term the green economy. Some studies have focused on the determinants of some components of climate smart agriculture, especially soil and water conservation approaches. Others have looked at it from how it affects yields, and others have studied how it affects poverty and so on. In this study, we try to contribute by looking at identifying the drivers and impacts of adoption of climate smart agriculture, and how adoption impacts on risk exposure. We'll explain what we mean by risk exposure in a few minutes. Across 3 agro-ecological zones in Ghana. Ghana has basically 6 agro-ecological zones, but we looked at the studied 3 agro-ecological zones in this particular study. We also relate climate smart agriculture to farm performance in this study. And the climate smart strategies we are looking at include crop choices. What we mean by crop choices, basically looking at drought tolerant, early maturing varieties. Soil conservation measures captured in this study include soil bounds, and then what we call the Zai technology. Space couldn't allow me to give you pictures of that. And then how jointly, when the two are adopted jointly, how will that affect farm performance and risk exposure? The 3 agro-ecological zones where we sampled we conducted this study include the Sudan Savannah in the extreme northern part of Ghana, the Guinea Savannah, where you move a little bit down south, and then the transitional zone, basically in the middle of Ghana. These areas are the areas that are much exposed to climate change, and they are also the bread baskets, especially from the transitional zone up north, up to the Guinea Savannah. They are the bread baskets of Ghana, and they are also really under the threat of climate change. The Sudan Savannah in particular experiences the highest form or the greatest average temperature with the minimal average rainfall. The 3 strategies considered the distribution across these 3 agro-ecological zones. We also try capturing that in this slide. We considered a lot of control for so many variables within our study, ranging from yield, inputs, farm level, as well as institutional variables we captured all these variables during the survey. But what is not indicated here, but is using GPS data, GPS or location-specific data, we're able to get location-specific temperature, which we merge with our cross-sectional data, and that enables us to look at basically the climate variable effects. Basically, that is rainfall, temperature, and we look at what we call the climate anomalies within this study. We tried looking at the distribution of the net revenues or crop yields look by the strategies that we have studied, and just to look at the variance, the skewness, which finally we use as a proxy for our risk exposure. Because we are using cross-sectional data, and because farmers' decision to choose these as adaptation strategies or these climate smart strategies might be influenced by selection bias, we try employing a model that will enable us to control for both observed and unobserved characteristics, as well as controlling for selection bias. So we employ the multinomial endogenous switching regression model that does perfectly that. And The model is briefly captured here in this study. What is interesting here, we will be able at the end of the day to get the average treatment effect on the treated because the model is able to get us the counterfactuals of those who actually adopted a strategy, and that is what we employed basically in the analysis. We look at the drivers, and basically the climate variables here, the average climate variable, we didn't see any direct statistically significant effects of rainfall or temperature, but the anomalies for rainfall, that was basically the long run average standard deviation, or the standard deviation expressed as a function of current climate variable. For instance, rainfall anomaly was the long-term standard deviation of rainfall expressed as a function of average rainfall at the time the data was taken at that particular location, because of the GPS data we used to capture location-specific rainfall as well as temperature. So these anomalies were found to be driving farmers' decision to adopt, and that is telling us something. Farmers are more averse to these spikes or random variations in rainfall or abnormal variations in rainfall, drive farmers to adapt to adopt climate smart agricultural practices. The same applies to temperature anomalies. We looked at the interaction between the two, and they all appeared to have a significant effect on farmers' decision to adapt climate smart agriculture. We also looked at plot level characteristics, and basically most of the plot level characteristics appear to drive climate smart agriculture adoption. Among the household level characteristics, we consider farmers' decision to partake in off-farm activity, because off-farm activity participation would have either positive or negative effect on adoption of climate smart agriculture practices, and because of the labor loss, potential labor loss effect, or potential income effect of off-farm work participation. And that aspect is displayed here in this particular study. Farmers' decision to partake in off-farm work significantly influences their decision to adopt crop choice. That is either use of drought-tolerant varieties or early maturing varieties. However, it has a significant negative effect on their decision to adopt soil and water conservation measures. And because of the labor demanding nature of soil and water conservation measures, whether stone bounding or Zai technology, these practices can be labor intensive, and that is potentially why the labor loss effect is significant here. Information-related variables were also found to be statistically significantly influencing farmers' decision to adopt either crop choice or soil and water conservation measures. The second component of the study looked at the effects of adoption of these, or the impact of adoption of these climate smart agriculture practices on important outcomes such as farm revenue and farmers, the downside risk. Downside risk here was captured in terms of skewness of farm revenues. And increasing skewness is an indication of the probability of reducing crop failure. And we saw that with regards to farm revenue, both crop choice and soil and water conservation measures increase farmers' yields or farm revenue by almost 12%. However, the joint adoption increased farm revenue by almost 20%. With regards to reducing the downside risk, crop choice and soil and water conservation individually increase skewness, and therefore reduce downside risks by 32 and 35% respectively. However, jointly, that reduced downside risks by almost 40%. We disaggregated this by agro-ecological zones, and we observed that the Sudan savanna here, the effect is quite significant with regards to the joint adoption. Joint adoption in the Sudan savanna is really strong and quite significant, and we are attributing it to probably farmers in this particular zone experience the lowest level of average rainfall and the highest level of average temperature, and that is telling us that Sudan savanna with this kind of condition, climatic conditions, farmers there, given the opportunity, will be an area where a lot of some of these climate smart practices will be worth experimenting and worth scaling up. What we can take home from this study is that there appear to be some complementarity between crop choice and soil and water conservation strategy. And that implies that efforts as promoting one of them is likely to result in the scaling up of the other. And that implies that the policy implication is that climate smart agriculture can be used as a means of hedging against the risk of production failure, and especially in areas where formal insurance, which is virtually absent in many areas in Ghana. So where formal insurance is absent, promoting climate smart agriculture, including soil and water conservation and crop choices, will enable farmers to hedge against the risk of production failure. Another important policy implication is that investment in this climate smart agriculture practices, promoting them and scaling them up in rainfall deficient areas, such as the Sudan savanna, or areas where average rainfall is a problem, will really lead to positive impacts. And we are therefore advocating the need to promote drought tolerant and early maturing varieties, and as well as updating farmers with recent climate information in order to enable them adapt to climate change by adoption of climate smart agricultural practices. Thank you very much for the attention. Over to you, Uma.
Thank you very much. That was a very interesting presentation, but we'll reserve questions until the final presentation made by Will Martin, who is a well-known ag economist, former president of IAAE, and he's done a lot of work on trade-related issues. So on to you, Will.
Great. Thank you very much, Uma. I'll just try to share the screen here and bring that in. Great. Can you see my slides?
Yes, it's visible.
Oh, terrific. Okay.
Yes, yes.
Terrific. Okay, so this is joint work with David Laborde, Abdullah Mamoun, Valeria Pinheiro and Rob Voss. Please tell them what you like about the work and tell me today what you don't like. So moving on to slide 2, the question we're looking at is, what are the impacts of agricultural support on greenhouse gas emissions? We know about $600 billion a year goes to agricultural support, mostly through border measures, but a large amount through subsidies, direct subsidies. And what we're building towards is identifying policies that better meet economic and environmental goals. How might that work, that support be repurposed? Of course, in this context, we've heard a lot about greenhouse gas emissions and global warming. agriculture is actually an important part of this. Agricultural emissions per se from production are around 10% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. Once we add land use and change, that's another 11%. In this initial work, we're focusing on the direct emissions from production agriculture. In current work, we're extending that to add land use and land use change, which is a much more complicated exercise. So what we're looking at is where do emissions come from agriculture? And here we build on the excellent work done by FAO, Tubiello et al. And what this reveals is just how concentrated the agricultural emissions are by commodity and by source of emissions. Over 80% come from milk, beef, and rice. Of that, almost half, 42%, comes from enteric fermentation, the emissions from ruminant animals, especially those used for milk and beef. Rice cultivation, almost 13%. So this very strong concentration is an important feature of agricultural emissions. And when we look at agricultural support, if we look over time, and here we're drawing on the OECD measures of agricultural support that cover most of world production. They cover almost all of the OECD and an important set of developing countries, including India, China, Brazil, and so on. What we see, the green part there of the left-hand chart, market price support, was totally the dominant part in the OECD countries, but domestic support, domestic subsidies, coupled subsidies were an important part until around the early 2000s, when with the implementation of the Uruguay round commitments, decoupled payments became a much more important part. In developing countries, if we go back to the early 90s, total agricultural support was negative. It hovered around zero for many years until around 2000, when it took off and became substantially positive. So it's now in the same order of magnitude as agricultural support in the industrial countries. Now, the data set development here, what we needed to know was, where are the emissions coming from? So we really want to know the source of those emissions. We want to be able to decompose it so that we could identify the importance of the scale of production and the methods of production used. So we looked at area, quantity, number of head. We use what are called the tier 1 IPCC coefficients to turn those into estimates of aggregate emissions, and we allocate that across by commodities and by type of production process. We're using a global general equilibrium model, and these calculations come after, posterior to the solution of the model. When we look at the support data set, market price support, about 254 billion of that total. What we're calling coupled subsidies. This is things like output subsidies, input subsidies, especially fertilizer subsidies, which play an important role in this process. Then the decoupled subsidies. And we also look at the general services, things like research, development, agricultural education, instruments that can improve productivity, that can give rise to the sorts of innovations we just heard about in the Ghana paper. Another thing we looked at was the importance of conditionality. Some support in the OECD measures is identified as having conditionality attached to it. And that's things like that restrict, for instance, the use of particular inputs. but that's always been thought of as fairly minor. It's only about 19% of the coupled subsidies part. But when you look, and we went through each of the estimates of support, you find that there's a very large part, 91 billion out of 163, that's subject to broader conditions that you have to participate. You have to meet these criteria in order to participate in support programs in the US and the EU in particular. So here's a potentially important lever for reform, for policy reform. Fertilizer subsidies, 12.8 billion. That, as we saw in the source of emissions, roughly 11 billion of support, of 11% rather of supports associated with nitrogen fertilizer. And then we have the other coupled subsidies that don't meet those criteria. It's important to know what sort of support and how it applies. International market access distortion, that's most of the support, as we saw, 254 billion on average. What we needed was estimates based on nominal rates of protection. So we're using measures from OECD that take into account non-tariff barriers, tariff rate quotas, export taxes, not just the import protection. And that's done using a price difference methodology. A problem in a global model is we need to take account of preferences. This is the average rate of protection, but some imports come, for instance, from Africa under the preference arrangements, come without facing those protection barriers. So we need to take account of those preferences. So what we've done, we rescaled all the bilateral tariffs to reproduce the weighted average nominal rates of protection. The global modeling framework, here we've used MIRAGRODEP model. It's a computable, a global computable general equilibrium model. It's based on the MIRAGE model developed at CEPI in France. It's a multi-region, multi-sector model, dynamically recursive. It builds on the GTAP global database. We're using a static version in this application. We're looking at land use constant so that we can focus on emissions from agriculture. If we allow, we get misleading results. If we allow land use change, but we don't allow for the implications of that land use change for emissions, that other important part of global emissions from agriculture. We hold employment constant. We use savings to define investment, very standard, simplifying assumptions. The current account surplus is constant in terms of global GDP, and net public savings are held constant via a neutral transfer to consumers. With the emissions, we want to know by commodity and by source. So we've got them identified specifically in cases like rice, methane emissions from flooding in rice, that other important dimension of emissions, production emissions from animals, enteric fermentation, from ruminant animals, enteric fermentation, and then the production emissions from fertilizer, chemical pesticides, and fossil fuel. We take all of those interactions into account, partly to capture the full impact of emissions, partly to allow for interventions that target either a particular type of emission or a particular commodity production. The scenarios that we use, first is domestic support. That's the subsidies, coupled subsidies that influence output and input use. We look at market access. We look at full policy removal. That's domestic subsidies and market access. And we look at a couple of productivity experiments like the innovations that underlay the climate smart agriculture experiments in the Ghana paper. We look at multifactor productivity, including intermediate input productivity and pure emission reductions. Now, when we remove coupled subsidies, what we find is that this reduces the emissions from agriculture, the CO2 equivalent of those emissions from agriculture, by about 0.6%. A large part of that comes from reductions in fertilizer use, but rice cultivation, manure, enteric fermentation from ruminants, and crop residue, the emissions from crop residue, the treatment of crop residues. Now, this result is not terribly surprising. It's perhaps smaller than we might have expected. But when you think about a coupled subsidy, you put on a subsidy that increases output in the country that's affected. It doesn't do anything to demand for agricultural commodities. So globally, it increases emissions. It increases emissions primarily in the country paying the subsidies, which are predominantly the richer countries. It reduces emissions elsewhere because it lowers world prices and cuts back production elsewhere. But on net, it increases agricultural output and it increases agricultural emissions. What about border measures? Now, border measures are quite a different story. You might think if you study emissions at a country level, it's going to look the same as taking away a coupled subsidy. Price paid is high because of the border measures. It falls, output falls, emissions fall. But when you think about it globally, what's happening to global production? Well, there's an import barrier is like a consumption tax and a production subsidy. And if you're thinking about, say, rice in Japan, the tax on consumption, the production potential in Japan is much less than the consumption. So what you're doing is you're taxing a large consumption base, you're subsidizing a small production base. So on net, there's very little impact on global output. And in contrast with subsidies, which increase global output, essentially border protection doesn't change global output. What does happen is the protection is more in countries with lower emission intensities. It tends to reduce global emissions. So simply abolishing market access barriers raises global emissions. It's not something we can't say simply that just removing emissions, removing these distortions would lower emissions. It's something of a surprise. What we see is we get increases in emissions from the countries where output expands, like Australia, Brazil, and India, because you're taking away a lot of taxation of agriculture. We get falls in output and emissions in China. When we look at coupled subsidies and border measures together, the net impact is quite small. It's to increase emissions. It's dominated by the border measures impact. And we see some substantial changes here, which are going to be quite important politically, of course, so that in some countries there are quite big increases in output. In countries like Japan, big reductions in output, and Canada and dairy, for instance, big reductions in output and big reductions in emissions as a consequence of that. Is it surprising that current trade policies are slightly reducing global emissions? And the answer there is no. High prices are reducing demand, as I mentioned. It's shifting production to countries with lower emission intensities. Free trade's optimal without externalities, but not necessarily in the presence of externalities. What this means is that simply just doing away with the subsidies, we often hear, oh, all of the support is raising global emissions. That's not actually the case once you look at it in this analytical way. But what does this mean? Does it mean we should do nothing? Not at all. What's very important is that we develop technologies to reduce emissions per unit of output, and we address pricing of greenhouse gas emissions. As we saw in the Ghana study, we've got several goals. What that means, we're going to need several instruments to achieve those goals. So things like improving technologies, which are part of the GSSE, part of the OECD measures of support, are needed to be part of that agenda. And the pricing of emissions is another important element. When we look at productivity, we have two experiments here, as I mentioned. If we raise productivity, we lower the amount of fertilizer needed per unit of input. We lower the amount of labor and capital. We do a neutral experiment, a neutral productivity. We increase efficiency of everything. That gives us reductions in emissions. But we get what's called a rebound effect. Because productivity is up, prices, consumer prices are down, there's an increase in consumption. And that rebound effect takes away roughly half the benefit in terms of reduced emissions. If we have a technology that just reduces emissions, and we see a lot of work on that, for instance, in the case of enteric fermentation from ruminants, trying to get that down, then we don't get the rebound effect. Of course, once we move to incorporate land use change, we don't get the saving on land use and those benefits as well. But this rebound effect is something we need to consider very carefully. The next steps we're doing now, broadening cover of measures, adding land use change, and looking more specifically at repurposing reforms and packages of reforms of the type we saw in the case of the Ghana study. So to conclude, Madam Chair, agricultural support is very substantial. We knew that. A lot of it is in the form of border measures, and some is from a couple of subsidies that actually increase overall emissions. Emissions from agriculture are important, strongly concentrated in beef, dairy and rice. Simple removal of support, not necessarily better for the environment. Removing coupled subsidies would be helpful. Removing trade-related measures would slightly increase emissions. Policy has multiple objectives. We're interested in efficiency, distribution, environmental impacts, resilience. Likely, we're going to need policies like R&D targeted to those objectives, rather than simple abolition or rearrangement of protection. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bill. That was a very stimulating paper. And now I'm going to turn to Shenggen Fan. Very few people need any introduction to Shenggen Fan. He's a very famous economist who headed IFPRI for many years and has now remigrated to China. So we are looking forward to his comments on all three papers. And then I'm hoping to give little bit of time to the three speakers to ask questions of each other. And then if there is any time left, leave it open for participants to ask their questions. So we will go in that order. So Shenggen, you are next. Thank you very much for being available for this role.
Thank you, Uma. So I enjoyed three presentations. But before this meeting, I didn't have a chance to read any articles or even any PowerPoints. So I just reflect on what they have said. And clearly, our food system are facing enough challenges: climate change, degradation of natural resources, the exclusion of enough vulnerable people from the food systems, and now the COVID-19. It really shows that how vulnerable our food system is. How is the climate change? To me, the climate change probably is one of the most significant factors that will affect our food system for a long time. Now, so the three sets of paper try to address the climate change. Now, some on adaptation, some on mitigation, and some on both of them. Now, this paper, I thought the quiz paper is quite interesting because it's one of the few papers that look at the behavior change because of the climate change. That's one. Secondly, we normally ignore the aquaculture fishing industry. I think this paper tries to address that sort of knowledge gap. Don't forget, all food systems include not just the stable food, and also livestock, fruits, vegetables, and fisheries. So now I do have a couple of questions. Let's say for Chris, I know that the well, when the temperature begins to rise, well, obviously the people will reduce their working time. It's simply too hot, from 28 degrees to 30 degrees. You will see enough people begin to stay home without going out. So what they will do is to go out during a certain day, a certain time of the day, and concentrate there, maybe early morning or in the evening. But maybe that's the reason why the fishermen reduce their time and try to change from passive gear to more aggressive or active gear. So I think that may be the reason. Now, but I have not heard about some other variables, controlling variables like migration or labor, because the study period covers several times. Is it possible that the labor is becoming more expensive, people move out, so that's why the fishermen also try to increase their effort, and also try to increase the catch per unit of the effort. So that I want to hear more from Chris. Now, here is a very good study. Now, on Cazella's paper, I mean, he presented some of the very sort of pessimistic pictures in Africa, for example. Especially in the last 60 years, the temperature has risen 2 degrees. That's huge. That's huge. Could you imagine in the next 60 years, the temperature will increase by another 2 degrees? And that's for 50% of the total greenhouse gas emission, at least in Ghana. Now, the CSA economy, smart agriculture involves not technology, because then two of them. One is crop growing, the other one is soil and water conservation. Now, I did hear from Zena, what do you mean crop? From what? From which crop to which crop? From single crop, fruits, vegetables, or vice versa. That has implication as well, not just on the climate adaptation, even mitigation. And then soil and water conservation, what type? And soil and water conservation also helps to mitigate the climate change, reduce the carbon emission. So I think it would be interesting to hear more on that. Now, I also need to hear that whether the data is a panel data over time, or whether it's just a 1 year data. But that makes a huge difference. With 1 year data, will not be able to identify enough causal relationship. It's basically just association or correlation. Very interesting to hear from you. Now, if the CSA really helps farmers to increase the yield, profit, also helps to mitigate the climate change, why the farmers don't do more? So that's another question I have. And what is the adoption rate there? What government can do? You said the government should promote CSA, soil and water conservation, or even jointly. Now, so how to promote? Subsidies, or with extension, or non-dissemination, or even compensation, where subsidy is part of the compensation. Farmers are doing something good for the environment, for the society. That's a positive externalities. That's how can public policy internalize all this sort of positive externalities. It's the sort of issue I wanted to hear from Gazella. Now, last presentation by Will. This presentation has a very significant finding. So that is the lifting trade barriers actually increase greenhouse gas emissions. What you can tell is not surprising, but it might have some important policy implications. Yes, the $600 billion subsidy is a huge gorilla in the room. They are not efficient. They do not produce nutritious, healthy foods. They also degrade our natural resources. Now, so how can we reform the subsidies? I think we all mentioned several think one direct option is to change all the subsidies to promote productivity growth. That's to promote green technologies or to reduce carbon emission, or to promote nutritious and healthy foods production. I think the model may be able to model that. I really hope we'll can do that. Now, if finding of the moving trade barriers as let's say will increase the greenhouse gas emission. So what would be the policy implication? One is obviously let's fix the production side. Let's say mitigation technology to reduce carbon emissions in major production countries. The other one is actually the importing countries to set some sort of green tax. This is something that is on a hot debate, whether the trade policy can be used to tax the unsustainable production. Partly because lots of food exporting countries have pretty large carbon emissions per unit of output. That's Brazil, US, Australia, India, and beyond. So if they export more, but in the meantime, the environmental cost has not been internalized, has not been reflected in pricing, can the importing countries do something? Obviously, it's easier to do that from production side, but can the importing countries do that? I wanted to ask whether it is possible, whether the WTO negotiation can also bring this issue to the next round of the discussion. Okay, thank you, Omar. This is 3 good papers, and I just reflected on the spot. I have not had a chance to read the papers slides beforehand.
Thank you, but very stimulating questions to the authors. So now I'm going to turn to the authors first to ask if they have questions or comments on each other's presentations and whether they have
somebody. By the way, Omar, can somebody let's say stop the sharing function? Looks like we are seeing somebody's email on the screen. Oh, great! That's good.
Okay,
Imagine.
that's great. Yeah. Let me just see if we have. You're saying that there are comments from the listeners, questions from the listeners. Is that what you're saying?
I don't know. Yes, might be. So you, I mean,
right.
The speakers can respond to my questions right now, or you can just let the participants to also answer the questions. So there's 3 speakers can answer them all together. It's up to you.
Right.
You're
so
in charge.
Right. So in the order in which I was going to go was to ask the 3 participants to ask if they have any questions of each other, and then turn to the listeners to see if they have any comments or questions they want to raise. So we have about 20 minutes. So Chris, Ghazali and Will, do you have comments on your colleagues' presentations?
Yeah.
Who is going to?
Ghazali, are you going? This is Chris. I have a couple of questions.
Okay. Yeah. Chris, please go ahead.
Okay. For Ghazali, for your paper, I'm really intrigued by your findings on downside risk. And I've not read the paper, forgive me, and maybe I missed it in your presentation, but you seem to be interpreting changes in skewness as telling us what's happening to downside risk. But a positive change in skewness can just mean an increased probability of a very high realization, not necessarily a reduction in adverse realizations. So have you controlled for this? Because if you're finding that that CSA is indeed reducing the probability losses, and especially of quite serious losses for farmers. That seems like a really important result to be promoting. So I'm keen to know a little bit more about that. And then for Will, I found this fascinating. I'm really struck by your findings, and I'm a little puzzled when I think of conditional farm subsidies. Maybe as an American, I have the wrong model in my head. I think of things like the Conservation Reserve Program in this country, and perhaps that's not, I've incorrectly understood your classification scheme. But you know, relaxing those policies, I would think, would have exactly, my intuition is it would have the opposite effect. So I'd love to hear you reflect a little bit more on perhaps using a few examples of conditional subsidies. What is it exactly that's happening there? I guess I'm missing part of it, or I'm just thinking of the wrong conditional subsidies. Those are my two questions for my fellow speakers. Thanks.
Thank you. So,
Yeah,
Ghazali.
Yeah, hello. Yeah, I have a question for Will.
Yep.
Yeah. Yes. The issue of removing subsidies. Removing subsidies is a major issue for developing country agriculture, and from the data you presented, I think Africa, of most of the countries were rather for the developed or other continents, from other continents. What has been running through my head is removing subsidies. Will you be referring to particular inputs or general inputs? For instance, fertilizer subsidies, subsidies for seed, for improved seed, issues that are even political in Africa and Ghana in particular, where every government is still talking about enhancing the agriculture sector, still using subsidies. And Ghana currently, they're talking about planting for food and jobs, and subsidy is an issue that is, so I don't know, within the context of this study, what will be the policy implication for a country like Ghana, or is within that? Thank you.
Right. Sure. Let me see. Uma, I'm not sure whether, I have a question for Chris and one for Ghazali. Maybe if I offer those, and should I then start the process of answering the questions that have come in, or will we do that later?
You could answer them briefly now and encourage people to write to you for more detailed responses.
Okay, great. So on Shenggen's excellent point, I mean, a border adjustment tax is another possible measure. We know it's actively under consideration. That's something that we will be looking at in the subsequent work. It's clearly not optimal. What you would want is uniform pricing, but it's worth looking at. Conditionality, Chris's point, we actually have not used the lever of conditionality in this current work. We've just identified that a large amount of subsidies, much larger than generally thought of, has some sort of conditionality which provides a lever that could potentially be used in reform actions. Then developing country agriculture, on Ghazali's, I think in general, fertilizer use is so low in Africa that we're not, no, I don't think anybody's thinking of that as something that needs to be reduced. That contribution to emissions overall is going to be quite small. My questions to add for Chris, I'm wondering, why does fishing effort go down when it's hot. It's not obvious that slightly hotter weather, especially since fishing is probably going to take place morning and evening and so on, it's not obvious why that fishing is going down. So that's a very simple question. And then for Ghazali and Awudu, my question there, what's the policy issue here? We have a set of innovations that are on the table. So is the problem that those innovations are not attractive enough for people, farmers to have already implemented them? Is this an issue about adoption of existing technology? Or are you looking towards innovations, research and development that will generate innovations and that will help encourage the move that you're looking at? So that's always the question. Is it innovation or adoption that's the issue here? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I'm now going to turn to the listeners of this, the audience, and see whether they have any comments or questions to the three speakers or to Shenggen. Anyone? Okay, in the meantime, I'm going to ask a couple of questions. Chris, from your presentation, what was slightly unclear is that the amount of time being spent on fishing has declined because of temperature increase, but the fish catch hasn't increased. Is it because they're using better technology? Is that the explanation for why the outcome this way? Can you elaborate on the reasons why you get this result? And then for Ghazali, I was pleasantly surprised to see that there are so many positive outcomes as a result of adaptation to climate change, and questions similar to Will's. If that is the case, why is it that more farmers aren't adopting it? Are the returns very low compared to business as usual, or is the research and extension system not being very effective? And for Will, my sense is that you started from the production end. You haven't looked at the demand and consumption issues which have been preoccupying nutritionists, saying that if we only reduce the amount of beef consumed or amount of milk consumed, emissions would go down, etc. So would you be doing some sensitivity analysis to see what the impact of changing consumption patterns would be on global trade and global production, not just from the production end, but from the consumption end? So those are my three questions. How would we proceed? Do you, Chris and Ghazali and Will, do you want to?
Sure. Who do you want to go first, Uma? You're in charge.
Chris, again, starting with Chris and Ghazali and Will.
Okay, so I've got, I believe, questions from Uma, Will, and Shenggen, which are all closely related. So Will asks, why does fishing effort go down? We can't directly answer that question because we can't model labor allocation properly. We can't observe that labor is moving into some other time use. However, we can use results from other studies. For example, several of us have a paper forthcoming in Economic Journal that looks at, in Kenya, what's happening as temperatures warm within season. And what we see is farmers are spending more time weeding, and they're also spending more money on pesticides, which is consistent with the agro-ecological changes that come from warming temperatures that change pest ranges and stimulate weed growth. you would expect something fairly similar, especially in this temperature range in this area of Cambodia. So one hypothesis would be that slightly warmer temperatures are stimulating a change in pest and weed pressure on crops, which is causing people to spend extra days weeding and combating different threats to their crop production. That is defensive investments in crop agriculture and livestock agriculture too, in other results. Defensive investments by farmers grow as temperatures warm. If that's true, and part of defensive investment in crop and livestock agriculture involves committing labor, then we should expect to see a reduction in the number of days that people are spending going fishing. So we can't observe this directly. We have to sort of piece it together from other bits of the literature due to limitations in our survey data. But we think that's the most plausible hypothesis. And the implication of that, to come to Shenggen's question of why is labor becoming more expensive, is that the opportunity cost of labor is rising because warming temperatures are making labor more valuable in some other activity than fishing. So in equilibrium, that should induce people to reallocate time away from fishing and towards this other activity. One hypothesis is things like defensive investments in crop and livestock agriculture, the result being that the marginal revenue product of labor in fishing is rising as the time spent in fishing is reduced. And that leads to Uma's question. It's not that fish catch is rising with warming temperatures. It's that controlling for time spent fishing and the gear one uses, catch is increasing. So catch per unit effort is increasing, which is of course completely consistent with the observation that if warming temperatures means that the use of labor in other activities is increasingly valuable, so that the opportunity cost of labor time spent fishing is rising, people should be reducing the amount of time they spend. And as long as production is monotone and concave, that will increase the marginal product of labor, so increase the catch per unit effort, which is exactly what we seem to be seeing. And that there's no technology change involved. We see no appreciable change in the gear people are using. There's certainly no introduction of new gear that we saw during the study period. So it really is just a labor response. And that's the key message of this paper, is that warming temperatures not only change the underlying ecology, the non-human parts of the system, they also are going to change human behaviors, and in particular they're going to change human labor allocation. So that's all.
Very interesting. Ghazali.
Yes, thank you very much. I will start with Shenggen's comments and then down to other comments. The issue of which specific crop, basically we looked at mixed crop farmers in Ghana, because the location where this study was done, farmers practice what we call mixed cropping, and to really identify or isolate the implementation of a specific climate smart practice on a plot on an individual crop will not be something that is practically feasible, especially if the farmer is not practicing monocropping. So we conducted this study among mixed crop farmers. The soil and water conservation strategies basically considered include what we call stone bands. These stone bands, farmers in the Upper East or the Sudan Savannah basically employ used stones to guard against soil loss and then water loss. And it's an important measure that enables farmers to address the issue of climate change, especially in areas where water is very scarce. Why adoption rates very low. Yeah, that is one of the issues that probably future studies will have to take up. But I can use a study that is very close to Ghana, or that is close to the Sudan Savannah in Burkina Faso, to probably attempt to answer why adoption rate is high, is very low for some of these strategies. The World Bank conducted a study on some of these soil and water conservation strategies, and a lot of farmers who were using these strategies, stone bands, Zai technology, immediately the World Bank project ended, many of the farmers withdrew or they disadopted these strategies. And the explanation the World Bank gave later was, that was 2009, is basically due to high rate of poverty, and that only a few farmers above a certain income level continue the practice of using these strategies. But the returns were really great. So the issue of adoption rates, probably another study we might have to go deep into the current adoption rates for some of these strategies. With regards to why skewness, the distribution skewness gives us a measure of, or gives us an idea of the spikes or the variability. There's some degree of variability, and some degree of variability, either one can employ the variance, or the variance might not be able to give us the exact measure of risk aversion or the risky nature of something. So we employ the skewness that has to do with a measure of downside risk. How?
Okay, we will stop there because Will has probably maybe a minute or so to respond, and then we have to end. We have to end this session.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Will?
I actually responded to the points before. So all I have at the moment is just to actually leave a question for Chris. If there is excessive fishing effort initially, and this rise in wages reduces fishing effort, you're picking up probably a short run gain in output. But I'm wondering if there's a longer run one that you may not have seen yet, which would be because the stock of fish would rise over the years, you might see a total increase in output. There could be a second best gain in there if the initial conditions are not efficient. So, but you know, thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure.
Yeah, thank you very much to all of you. I've been very concerned that we are not doing enough research on impacts of climate change on agriculture, or vice versa, impact of agriculture on climate change. So this session helps to bridge a major gap in that area, and I'm most grateful to all the three of you for excellent papers, and I want to congratulate us for being able to use Zoom in a way which finally worked. So thank you very much all. Bye.
Thanks. Bye, folks.